The Singing Girl, Chapter 3. Minh Khôi shot up, his eyes wide open. The clock on the wall chimed precisely at 12. A dark shadow suddenly appeared outside the window, yet he remained unaware. In a daze, Minh Khôi vividly recalled the lyrics of that song, the very voice singing it echoing clearly in his mind. Years ago, during those evenings spent together, Dạ Lan would often practice that play upon returning to their shared room. She had even mentioned that no matter how hard she tried, she could never sing to her satisfaction. Thus she had to practice daily. Consequently, Minh Khôi could never forget that familiar melody, ingrained in his memory. Suddenly, he felt a chilling sensation envelop him, goosebumps rising on his skin as if someone were staring intently at him. Slowly turning his head, he let out a terrified scream. Just moments before, he had seen two shadows standing there. Was it real? Minh Khôi was uncertain. Now, with just a blink, the darkness outside the window remained, devoid of any figures. He tightened his grip on the blanket, squeezed his eyes shut, and shook his head to calm himself before opening them once more. There was nothing there except for 3 trees swaying gently in the wind. He wondered if the sleepless nights spent arguing with Tien Kim had left him dizzy and disoriented. Carefully, he recalled the previous night spent by the bamboo fence. He had clearly heard someone calling his name, and he had even seen the boat rocking gently. The haunting strains of De Ko Hai Lang echoed in his ears. He could not have mistaken that, and he was certain he had not been dreaming. Suddenly, Minh Khôi heard the sound of wooden clogs echoing, halting right outside his room. In the stillness of the night, the sound resonated unnaturally, yet the figure outside remained silent, neither leaving nor entering. Minh Khôi stared intently at the door, then slowly sat up and lit the candle, casting light throughout the room. His hand trembled slightly as he approached the door. "Is anyone there?" he called out, his voice trembling slightly in the flickering light. He peered down at the threshold and saw a figure standing motionless. "Who are you?" he asked again. But still, there was no reply. The shadow slowly reached up and placed a hand on the door. The wooden door, with its slatted ventilation, cast a long shadow of the figure against the light behind it, resembling a malevolent claw. The corner of Minh Khôi's eye twitched as he instinctively took a few steps back, his heart pounding fiercely in his chest, beating loudly. Suddenly, the door swung open. His pupils dilated as he realized it was Tien Kim standing before him. Minh Khôi was so startled that he couldn't utter a word, his entire body stiffening. Tien Kim remained silent, just staring at him, her eyes wide open. Turned out she was not a ghost. Minh Khôi felt as though he could finally breathe again and exhaled slowly. "Where have you been?" He placed the candle on the table and poured himself a cup of tea. Tien Kim still stood at the door. He thought she might still be angry about earlier, which was why she didn't respond. He took a sip of tea, feeling the fear gradually ebb away. "Since you've returned to your room, why don't you just sleep? What are you still standing there for?" But before he could finish his sentence, he heard a faint noise behind him and turned to look. Tien Kim stumbled over the threshold, her body rigid as if she hadn't walked in ages. Her head tilted slightly to one side. Her eyes appeared vacant, dark circles under them. The candlelight behind her illuminated her face, casting it into an eerie shadow that seemed unsettlingly strange. "What's wrong with you?" Minh Khôi asked slowly as he approached. But suddenly, Tien Kim glared at him, her fingers extended slightly, as if he had grabbed her. But quickly she let them fall away. Are you feeling ill? Why are you so cold?" Tien Kim looked at Minh Khôi slowly, her eyes bloodshot and teary. Did you cry earlier?" Khôi. Minh Khôi furrowed his brow. He had never loved this fierce woman in the past or present. Yet she was still his wife. He realized that if he remained indifferent, it would only anger Tien Kim and spark another argument. She had never known the meaning of reason, speaking only from her thoughts. This would surely provoke Mr. Kien, complicating matters even further. Minh Khôi did not want to tarnish his image in his father-in-law's eyes. Although Tien Kim was his daughter, she was still doted upon by her father, so he had to tread carefully. The events of the past are long over. Some things are better left unspoken. It's late, and I don't want to quarrel with you. Go to sleep. Tomorrow we're visiting grandmother. As Minh Khôi turned to his bed, he suddenly heard a peculiar call from Tien Kim. Khôi. She called him, yet remained rooted to the spot, her feet unmoving. Minh Khôi sensed something was distinctly odd about her today. She lacked the usual fierceness, replaced instead with an eerie presence. Are you all right? Is something hurting? Tien Kim did not respond. Minh Khôi hesitated to ask further, suspecting he was losing his mind. He extinguished the candle and lay down in bed, pulling the blanket up to his chin. In that moment, the room plunged into complete darkness. Devoid of any light, Tien Kim stood there, her neck tilted slightly, taking slow, deliberate steps. As she passed by the mirror, she suddenly let out a blood-curdling scream. Minh Khôi sat up in shock, seeing Tien Kim sitting on the floor, curled up, clutching her knees, trembling all over. She must have seen something horrifying. Hey, are you okay? He rushed over to help her up. There's a ghost. Tien Kim gazed through Minh Khoi's shoulder, pointing at the mirror, her face devoid of color. Tears streamed down her cheeks. Minh Khôi had never seen Tien Kim so frightened. Normally, she was proud and never showed weakness before him. Her current demeanor was clearly abnormal. And once again, that haunting melody echoed. Then, a chilling, sinister laughter filled the night. Minh Khôi observed the disoriented expression on his wife's face, and he felt his own heartbeat quicken in fear. Clenching his jaw, he bit his lip. Slowly, he reached for a chair beside him. Turning quickly, he hurled it at the mirror. The sound of shattering glass rang out. He approached cautiously, peering into the shattered reflection, but saw no one there. Furrowing his brow, he turned again, only to find Tien Kim had vanished. She was slowly walking towards the bed, lying down as if nothing had happened, as if the earlier scene had been a mere trick to frighten him. Minh Khôi stared for a moment before shaking his head. Was it possible he had truly lost his mind? Or had Tien Kim gone mad? He moved towards the window, pushed open the two shutters, and carefully leaned out to look. Outside, aside from the occasional swaying shadows of the trees, nothing else was there. However, unbeknownst to him, as he turned away from the window, a child's face appeared in the broken glass, with dark, eerie eyes staring back at him, smiling wickedly. He saw no one. Minh Khôi sighed heavily, carefully closing the window before lighting the candle again. The warm glow quickly filled the room with comfort. He sat there throughout the night, unable to close his eyes. The following morning, he awoke to the sound of bustling outside. Turned out he had sat there all night. The candle had burned down and extinguished long ago. He lifted his gaze to see Tien Kim still curled under the blanket, facing the wall in deep sleep. He let out a quiet sigh and got up to leave the room. Downstairs, people were chopping wood, cooking, and preparing for the upcoming anniversary meal the next day. The white ducks were captured, quacking incessantly. Soon, Mr. Hoy and the family would visit the grave to clear weeds and light incense for his mother. Meanwhile, the upper house was being readied for the offerings. Everyone was busy with their tasks. Even Nam, the driver, was helping to prepare the ducks with B2 behind the house. When they saw Minh Khôi come down from the house, his face slightly darkened. B2 immediately asked, "Hey, Duong Ba, did you not sleep well last night? Your eyes look so sunken." Minh Khôi shook his head, avoiding B2's gaze. "Oh, no, it's nothing." After saying that, he didn't elaborate, heading straight to the well to wash his face. B2 watched closely. Was it because he hadn't slept that Duong Ba looked so weary? He couldn't be that weak-minded. As B2 turned around, he noticed Nam was staring intently at him. "What's wrong?" "Hey." Be Tuesday, do you believe that one day Mrs. Ba will cut your tongue off? B2 snorted in disbelief. What do you mean cut off my tongue? You're being too nosy, making Duong Ba uncomfortable. B2 dismissed his words, retorting in a raspy voice. I'm just asking because I care about Duong. I'm worried he didn't sleep well, and it might affect his health. I'm just looking out for Mrs. Ba. After washing his face, Minh Khôi didn't return to his room but went upstairs to join Mr. Hoi and the guests. Some local dignitaries had also come to visit. Normally, Minh Khôi excelled at communication, articulating everything clearly, which pleased Mr. Kien greatly. In the lower house, several women were preparing dishes. All eyes focused on the guest house. Hey, where are you taking the food? I'm bringing food to the performers. On Nam. Oh, really? Let me carry it for you. As Binam spoke, he reached out to take the tray of food from her. Is that okay? Those are women. Why not? Just hand it over to me. Before Bisao could reply, Binam snatched the tray and strode off. On his way, he ran into B2. Hey, Binam, where are you off to looking so cheerful? Heh, I'm taking food to the theater troupe. B2 let out a scoff, clearly unimpressed. Ha, you're going to see my chow. Huh? Why not take me along? Who's stopping you? Yeah, I'm going to see my chow. He replied with annoyance. B2 chuckled, his eyes twinkling mischievously. Ko is in that room over there. Even if you run, you won't see anything. They're women. It would be strange to scare them off so early in the morning. Binam beckoned B2 closer and whispered in his ear. Listen, I've been running around several districts since last night, and I still can't find her. She seems afraid of the light. She hasn't come out of her room since this morning. Well, she's the leading actress. Do you think she'll just show herself to you? Last night, she wore a hat pulled down tight, and even when I looked closely, I couldn't see her face. He lamented with regret. Last night, I planned to bring her out to meet Mrs. Ba, but Mrs. Ba said no. Just let it be. Suddenly, B2 glanced toward Tien Kim's room, as if recalling something. Oh, speaking of which, why hasn't Mrs. Ba been seen all day? Later, go ask her what she wants to eat, so I can prepare it. Binam waved his hand dismissively. In the city, I'm usually just a driver. If anyone needs me, they call. I rarely do these little tasks, especially to avoid clashing with Mrs. Ba. She's fierce. I'd rather stay out of her way. B2 squinted. Hey, do you want me to get slapped? Mrs. Ba holds grudges. She'll hit you on sight. You're the only one close to Mrs. Ba. Who else am I going to ask? Hearing that, Binam, flattered, beamed with pride. Okay, fine. I'll take the food to the troupe. Then I'll call Mrs. Ba. B2 smiled widely, revealing his teeth. Make it quick. As Binam carried the food upstairs, the theater troupe's room was eerily quiet. Some were cleaning tables, others adjusting costumes, but not a sound could be heard, as if darkness enveloped the space. Feeling anxious, Binam glanced toward the small room with the red curtain. Certain that my chow was inside, he swallowed nervously and approached the girl cleaning the props, whispering, Excuse me, is my chow in there? The girl smiled. Yes, my chow is rehearsing. Binam looked down at the tray of food, regretting that he had fought for the chance to see my chow, only to come up empty-handed. Oh, well, the kitchen said if anyone isn't full, they can call down for more. The girl replied cheerfully. Thank you. Binam nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on the red curtain, imagining the silhouette of the girl within. As he slipped outside, a gust of wind lifted the curtain, revealing a figure in a red dress, her lips painted, smiling coldly. Returning home, Binam knocked on Tien Kim's door. Mrs. Ba. Mrs. Ba. Inside, silence greeted him. He mumbled, Could she really still be asleep at this hour? At that moment, Tan Trung came down from the front of the house and asked Binam, What's up? Binam, overjoyed to see him, exclaimed, "Mr. Hai, I've been calling for Mrs. Ba, but there's been no response." Tan Trung raised an eyebrow, knocked on the door several times, then pushed it open. The scene inside startled him, but he quickly regained his composure. "Tien Kim, what are you doing sitting here in the dark?" Tien Kim sat curled up on the bed, her head bowed, her hands fidgeting. "Don't open the curtains." Hearing that, Tan Trung sat down beside her. "Do you want breakfast? The kids have been bringing food up for a while." Tien Kim didn't respond, her gaze fixated on the broken mirror in the corner. Seeing this, Tan Trung glanced over, then clicked his tongue. "How did it break? You can't just smash things in grandmother's house. If father finds out, he'll definitely scold you." As he finished speaking, Tan Trung leaned in to pick up the shards of glass scattered on the floor. Suddenly, he cut his finger on a shard, bright red blood dripping onto the mirror's surface. He winced, standing up to pull out a handkerchief from his pocket to wipe the blood from his finger. Unbeknownst to him, the blood that fell onto the mirror had vanished, as if someone had absorbed it completely. "Never mind, I'll call someone to clean it up. You should go eat," Tan Trung said, reaching out to take hold of Tien Kim's wrist. The moment he touched her, he felt a jolt. Her body was icy cold, like a block of ice. At that moment, he noticed her hair was messy, unkempt as if it hadn't been brushed. "Hey, what's wrong with you?" Tien Kim whispered, her voice trembling. There's a ghost." Her eyes were glazed over, her fingers quivering slightly. Tan Trung leaned closer to hear her better when suddenly, a voice called from outside, "Mr. Hai, the old man wants to see you." Tan Trung frowned. "What about Mrs. Ba?" "Yes, the old man said if Mrs. Ba is tired, she can rest and doesn't have to go." He glanced at Tien Kim for a moment, then stood up. "Make sure you wash your face and come eat. Father will definitely scold you if he sees you like this." Having said that, Tan Trung left the room. As the door closed, Tien Kim suddenly straightened her back. Shivering, her eyes took on a sinister quality, her tongue lolling out to lick her lips as she crawled to the floor, slithering like a ghost. That day, after visiting his mother's grave, Mr. Kien, along with Tan Trung and Minh Khôi, went to the temple and visited several local authorities. Mrs. Xian returned home early, but as soon as she did, she felt a headache coming on and went to lie down. The house staff wanted to call Tien Kim several times but hesitated, simply placing a tray of food in front of her door. That afternoon, guests began to arrive in droves, everyone bustling about. After finishing their tasks, the staff quickly returned to entertain the guests, no one paying any attention to Tien Kim. The household was busy preparing food for the evening. Although today wasn't the main day, the guests were particularly numerous. The Kien family was renowned, with visitors flowing in continuously. In the guest house room, a woman dressed in a crimson robe, a jade green belt cinched at her waist, and black embroidered shoes adorned with phoenix designs, was meticulously painting her eyebrows. It was Mai Chao, the leading actress of the Ba Sun troupe. Her sharp phoenix eyes and bright red lips exuded an air of pride. A voice echoed from behind her. "Mai Chao, are you ready yet?" Mai Chao stared intently into the mirror, responding softly, "Yes, I'm finished." Behind her stood Uncle Ziam, her father and the owner of the theater troupe, a man in his 50s with silver hair. He gazed at his daughter through the mirror, his eyes suddenly glistening with unshed tears. "Years ago, your sister often played this role. If your father and I hadn't separated, perhaps she wouldn't have had to suffer so." Mai Chao pressed her lips together, silently reminding her father not to say more. The pain of losing her sister had always haunted her. Uncle Ziam looked at the photograph of Delan, Mai Chao's unfortunate sister. In the picture, Delan portrayed the character Fan Luqiu, her beauty breathtaking. She had passed away at the tender age of 20, leaving behind a profound, unresolved grief. Mai Chao clenched her teeth and vowed, Today, I will show everyone Minh Khoi's true face. Avenging my sister. Looking at my chow's tear-filled eyes, Uncle Ziam asked gently, "Do you regret it?" My chow shook her head. "No, father. I'm not afraid. I just want to settle this score." Uncle Ziam glanced out the window and sighed deeply. The theater would never be the same again. But he told himself that this passion was worth sacrificing for his daughter. The small stage in the courtyard was draped in bright red. The drums and gongs were ready. Below, long benches and straw mats were laid out neatly, and the sounds of chatter and laughter filled the air. This was the first time a renowned troupe like Basun had performed here, generating great excitement among the audience. While the outside buzzed with life, inside, Mr. Kien angrily slammed a teapot to the floor, shouting, "Who dared to invite the troupe here?" Mrs. Shen waved a fan and softly advised, "Dear, we have guests. Please don't make a scene." Mr. Kien turned, angrily calling, "Where's Tan Trung? I'm asking where he is." B. Tuesday, hearing this, shrugged and replied, "Mr. Hai has gone outside." Mr. Kien knew full well that in this house, only Tan Trung harbored a fixation with the theater, and he was certain this was his doing, that rebellious child of his, the son of the actress Kim Lai, whom he had once adored but now harbored deep resentment towards. As Mr. Kien spoke, his chest heaved, his eyes wide with fury. "Hey, I'll go call Mr. Hai." B2 quickly dashed off, leaving a tense atmosphere in the house like never before. The house had been restless for 2 days, but this time, it seemed to be something major. From the staff to the family members, everyone knew that for this family, the term theater was taboo. They were all astonished to see the troupe invited. Yet they were unaware that this was the doing of Tien Kim and had not been approved by Mr. Kien. Now, as Mr. Kien fumed, everyone worried that the performance would be cancelled. A moment later, Tan Trung descended from upstairs. As he entered the room, before he could settle himself, Mr. Kien bellowed, "Who told you to invite the troupe here? Didn't your grandmother dislike performers? Have you forgotten? Do you want to die?" The invitation to the troupe was indeed Tien Kim's idea, but Tan Trung didn't blame her. He cast a glance at Mrs. Shen, who remained silent, perhaps unaware of the situation or possibly knowing but unwilling to speak. For years, he had come to understand the true nature of those around him. Tan Trung told himself that this was a rare opportunity to express the grievances weighing on his heart. Even though he knew there were guests outside, after years of waiting, that moment had finally come. "Father, was it grandmother who disliked performers, or was it you?" Mr. Kien was taken aback by Tan Trung's question, staring at him in disbelief. What did you just say?" Tan Trung clenched his teeth, took a deep breath, bowed his head, and looked directly at Mr. Kien. "Father, why haven't you brought Mother back after all these years since her passing?" Mrs. Shen frowned, about to speak but stopping herself, the corners of her mouth twitching upwards slightly. In her heart, she felt a sense of joy watching the rift grow between father and son. After all, only Minh Khoi was currently tending to the family business in Saigon, while Tan Trung contributed nothing. If Mr. Kien were to diminish Tan Trung's share of the family fortune over this matter, she and her son would surely benefit. Mr. Kien tightened his grip, slamming his hand down on the table. "What mother? Your mother is right here." He pointed at Mrs. Shen, who immediately bowed her head, her face a picture of indignation, lifting her hand to wipe away her tears. "Oh, woe is me. I raised you, cared for you, and now you speak to me like this." Tan Trung paid no mind to her reaction. From a young age, he had grown up in his grandmother's coldness and the veiled mistreatment from this woman. Before others, Mrs. Shen always feigned affection, but behind their backs, she constantly berated him, leaving him in torment. Fortunately, he had matured early, leaving home to live a life of freedom. "Father, you understand what I'm saying. I'm no longer a child. I've endured enough in this house over the years." Mr. Kien gritted his teeth, glaring intensely at Tan Trung. What do you mean you've endured? You eat and live well here, even going to the west and the east. Try being born in another house, where you wouldn't even have a bowl of rice to eat. The conversation had clearly strayed far from Tan Trung's original intent. He only wanted to speak about his mother. But the dialogue had devolved into a confrontation over family and duty. Before he could respond, Mrs. Xian interrupted, her voice brightening. Now that you're all grown up, you don't need to call me mother anymore. Do you? Oh dear. Let me just die. Mrs. Xian spoke amidst her sobs. But Tan Trung merely stared at her coldly. After years living in this house, he had become all too aware of the true and false faces around him. Mrs. Xian's acting was so masterful that Tan Trung mused that if anyone were suited to play the role of an actress, it would be her. Be quiet, Mr. Qian roared, causing Mrs. Xian to immediately fall silent. Wiping her tears away, Tan Trung regarded the scene with a bitter smile. Di Xian has cared for me. I do not forget her kindness. But mother has been dead for over 25 years. Why have you left her alone in that grave? Nameless and without identity. A neglected tomb? Why can't you bring her back? Mr. Qian remained silent, bowing his head, his lips pressed tight. Tan Trung felt a pang of sorrow, his voice dropping to a mournful tone. Father, do you also look down upon performers? Hearing this question, Mr. Qian frowned, a hint of inner conflict flashing in his eyes. Yet he did not respond. Tan Trung looked at his father, a sardonic smile creeping onto his lips. Now he understood. The greatest obstacle was not his grandmother but rather his father, the very man whom his mother had once loved wholeheartedly. Father, if you held my mother in such disdain, then why did you live with her, allowing her to take her own life in despair? For 15 years, you have left her without a name or identity, a forsaken grave. Back then, when grandmother was alive, you said you didn't dare to go against her wishes out of fear of upsetting her. But grandmother has been gone for a long time, and you still do nothing. Upon hearing this, Mr. Qian, furious, slammed his palm down on the table, shaking with rage. You ungrateful child! Tan Trung was struck. His face turned to the side, his cheek instantly swelling, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. Seeing the blood flow from his son's face, Mr. Qian's eyes flashed with pain, but he quickly masked it, maintaining a calm demeanor. It was a waste to raise you, to feed and clothe you. Even a dog knows how to repay kindness. And yet you are not worthy to be my son. Get out of my house and go find your mother. The actress. Father! Tan Trung cried out, pained by his father's harsh words. How could he insult his mother so? Even after her death? He stared at his father, his eyes glistening with tears, his voice thick with emotion. If you despised my mother so, then why did you stay with her, leaving her in despair to the point of taking her own life? For the past 15 years, you've left her nameless and without identity, a forsaken grave. Back then, when grandmother was alive, you claimed it was out of fear of upsetting her wishes that you did not act. But grandmother has been gone for a long time now, and yet you still do nothing. Upon hearing this, Mr. Qian, furious, slammed his palm down on the table, trembling with rage. You ungrateful child! Tan Trung was struck. His face turned to one side, his cheek instantly swelling, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. Seeing the blood flow from his son's face, Mr. Qian's eyes flashed with pain, but he quickly masked it, maintaining a calm demeanor. It was a waste to raise you, to feed and clothe you. Even a dog knows how to repay kindness. Yet you are not worthy to be my son. Get out of my house and go find your mother. The actress. Father! Tan Trung cried out, pained by his father's harsh words. How could he insult his mother so? Even after her death? He looked at his father, tears glistening in his eyes, his voice choked with emotion. If you have always looked down on her, why did you once choose to be with her? If you never loved her, why did you allow her to suffer alone? abandoned in a grave. Mr. Kien's expression hardened. His fists clenched tightly at his sides. You know nothing. You were too young to understand anything. Your mother was not innocent. She made her own choices. Tan Trung's heart raced with anger and pain. Those choices led her to despair. And yet you blame her? If you truly loved her, you would have fought for her. In that moment, a heavy silence fell between them, thick with unspoken words and unresolved feelings. Mr. Kien's gaze hardened, and he turned away, refusing to meet his son's eyes any longer. Leave my sight, he commanded, his voice low and menacing. With a heavy heart, Tan Trung turned and walked away, his mind swirling with turmoil. The weight of their family's history pressed down on him, and as he exited, he felt the coldness of the world outside seep into his very soul. Oh, heaven above! What about the theater troupe? Mr. Kien's chest heaved with each ragged breath, a chaotic storm brewing within. Enough of this. There shall be no singing. Mrs. Xian frowned. My dear, the guests are all here now. Perhaps you could let it slide. Injustice. It is truly injustice, Mr. Kien bellowed, his gaze fixed upon the retreating figure of Tan Trung. Suddenly, a sharp pain seized his chest, causing him to sway before collapsing. Mrs. Xian rushed to his side. Sir, what's wrong with you? Mr. Kien weakly raised his hand. I'm fine. You go tend to the guests. Mrs. Xian hesitated, but eventually departed. Alone in the room, Mr. Kien sat there, his solitary silhouette cast upon the wall in the dim light. The sound of drums from outside echoed in, stirring memories of his first love. Kim Lai, he could see her, the actress from years gone by, perched on a bridge, her smile like morning dew, shimmering in his recollection. Lost in the past for a time, Mr. Kien silently rose, walked to the cupboard, and retrieved the key to unlock an intricately carved wooden box, containing mementos of the woman he had once loved wholeheartedly, yet had also deeply hurt. With a quiet farewell, the little girl slipped away. 2 days passed in unrest within the home. This time, however, the matter seemed grave. Everyone knew this family held a deep aversion to the phrase theatrical arts. Yesterday, upon seeing Khan summoned to perform, the staff felt a twinge of something unusual, but they were unaware that it was the children who had invited him without consulting Mr. Kien. Now, seeing him so furious, they feared the festivities could not continue. After a moment, Tan Trung descended from the upper house. As he stepped into the room, before he could steady himself, Mr. Kien roared, Hey, who told you to invite the theater troupe here? Back when she was alive, your grandmother detested singers. Don't tell me you've forgotten and dared to bring them here? Do you want to die? The invitation for Khan to sing had been purely Tien Kim's idea. Tan Trung glanced at Mrs. Xian, who said nothing. Perhaps she was unaware or perhaps she knew but chose not to reveal that it was her own daughter behind the act. Years had passed. Enough time for him to see the true face of a person. Yet, Tan Trung remained silent about the truth. It seemed a rare opportunity to voice his pent-up frustrations. Though guests were present, it was said, and since the matter had been raised, he would naturally follow suit. After years of waiting, the time had finally come. Father, is it grandmother who disdains singers? Or is it you? Mr. Kien's lips twitched at Tan Trung's question, disbelief flickering in his eyes. What did you just say? Tan Trung clenched his jaw, exhaling deeply, his gaze fixed on Mr. Kien. Father, why is it that after all this time, you haven't brought grandmother's ashes home? Mrs. Xian, overhearing, knitted her brows, ready to interject but ultimately held her tongue, a slight smile tugging at her lips. The growing rift between Tan Trung and Mr. Kien brought her a strange sense of joy. After all, only Minh Khôi was tending to the family's affairs in Saigon while Tan Trung contributed nothing. If Mr. Kien were to reduce Tan Trung's inheritance because of it, she would be the one to benefit. Mr. Kien, upon hearing Tan Trung's words, was consumed by rage. his fists clenched. He slammed them down on the table, making a resounding thud. Which mother? Your mother is right here in front of you. He pointed at Mrs. Xian, who finally averted her gaze, looking pitiful. You've been cared for by her since you were a child. Now you dare to question who your mother is? Mrs. Xian sank into a chair, raising an arm to dab at her tears. Oh, heaven, how I've suffered. I raised you, took care of you in every little way, and now you, oh, heaven. Tan Trung paid no heed to her reaction. From a young age, he had endured the coldness of his grandmother, while suffering under this woman's hand. Yet he had never revealed this to his father. Mrs. Xian was warm on the outside but cold within. Before others, she feigned affection, but behind their backs, she hurled insults and criticisms, leaving him in torment. Fortunately, I matured quickly during that time, feeling a sense of freedom. Father, you know what you're talking about. You're not a child anymore. After all these years in this house, you've endured enough. Mr. Qian gritted his teeth, glaring at Tan Trung. What do you mean? Endured? You've eaten well and dressed nicely, even traveled to the West and Europe with others. Try being born in another house. You wouldn't even have a bowl of rice to eat. The conversation had gone too far. He only wished to speak of his mother, so why had it escalated to this? Hey, father! Before Tan Truc could interject, Mrs. Xian interjected. Now you're all grown up, no longer needing to call me mother, right? Oh, just let me die already, Mrs. Xian wailed, her sobs echoing. Tan Trung regarded her with weary eyes. After so many years in this house, he had learned to discern their performances from their truths. Mrs. Xian was more suited to the stage than his own mother. She performed splendidly, never knowing what it meant to feel shame. Shut up! Mr. Qian's voice boomed, and Mrs. Xian fell silent, wiping her tears away with trembling hands. Tan Trung noticed the corners of his lips curling upward slightly. I have not forgotten Aunt Xian's care for me, but my mother has been gone for over 25 years. She lies out there in the cold earth. Why can't you bring her back? Humph! I am your father. I am the head of this family. You have no right to demand anything of me. Tan Trung lowered his gaze, then hoarsely replied, his voice tinged with sorrow. Father, do you also look down upon singers? Mr. Qian's brows knitted tightly, yet he offered no response. A hidden conflict flickered in his eyes. Tan Trung's lips curled into a bitter smile. He realized he had been mistaken all along. He had thought his mother's absence was due to his grandmother's interference. But the truth was otherwise. Now that she was gone, Mr. Qian had done nothing for the woman he had shared a life with and had a child together. Turned out he had never remembered her. His mother had unwittingly surrendered herself to a wretched man. Truly a despicable creature. Father, if you look down on my mother, then why did you pursue her? Why did you leave her to drown herself? And for 15 years, let her remain alone and cold, nameless and forgotten, a lonely grave out there. He paused, then continued, when grandmother was alive, she said you didn't want to upset her, so you obeyed her wishes, but she has been dead for a long time, and still, you do nothing. Mr. Qian remained silent, merely pursing his lips as he stared at the ground. Surely he could see that his actions were sowing seeds of suffering that would come back to haunt him. Before his words could conclude, Tan Trung felt the sting of a slap across his face, echoing loudly in the room. Ah, truly ungrateful. Tan Trung's head was thrown to one side, his cheek swelling instantly, a trickle of blood at the corner of his mouth. Seeing the blood flow from his son's face, Mr. Qian's eyes clouded over with anger, his hands trembling, yet he quickly regained his composure. I wasted my efforts raising you, feeding you. Even a dog knows how to repay its benefactor. Yet you speak such disrespect. I have no son like you. Get out of my house. Go find your mother. The singer. Father. His father's words seemed to drain the love between them completely. How could he utter such harsh words about someone he had once cherished? Even in death, must he insult her? Gritting his teeth, eyes bloodshot, Tan Trung could no longer hold back. Mr. Kien, if you despised my mother back then, why did you ever take her in the first place? Mr. Kien glared at Tan Trung, pointing toward the door. You, get out. At that moment, Mrs. Shen finally stood up. Calm down, please, calm down. Tan Trung pressed his lips together, his eyes reddening with emotion. Fine, if you won't bring mother back home, then I'll do it myself. This is your house, and if you want me to leave, I will. With that, Tan Trung turned his back and stormed out. Outside, Little B2 saw him and rushed after him. Hey, where are you going? The troupe is performing right now. Ignoring the boy's words, Tan Trung strode purposefully toward the front door. B2 scratched his head in confusion. But what about the performance? From somewhere, Mr. Kien's chest began to rise and fall in a chaotic rhythm, his breath growing erratic. Stop it. There will be no singing. Mrs. Shen furrowed her brow. Dear, we've invited guests, and they're all here. Just let it go. The injustice. It truly is unjust. Goodness gracious. Mr. Kien glared in the direction Tan Trung had disappeared, when suddenly a jolt coursed through his chest, and he stumbled, collapsing. Mrs. Shen rushed to his side. Oh, sir, what's wrong? He raised a hand in protest. I'm fine. You go attend to the guests. But go on. Mrs. Shen hesitated momentarily but quickly departed. In the room, only Mr. Kien remained. He sat in his chair, the dim light casting a lonely shadow on the wall. Outside, the sound of singing mixed with the rhythm of drums drifted in. And without warning, he was swept back to 26 years ago. At that time, he had been a wealthy young master, infamous for his charm, having his way with the wind and rain. One day, as he glided along the river in a boat, he chanced upon the actress Kim Lai sitting on a bridge, her black skirt twisted to her knees, bare feet dangling in the cool water, her voice lilting a melody. In front of her were clusters of purple water hyacinths. Under the morning sun, Kim Lai wore a smile as fresh as dew. She had been his first love. Yet, alas, Kim Lai was but a singer. They enjoyed a passionate romance, believing their moments together would last forever, until his mother discovered their secret. And they were soon torn apart. After giving birth, on a stormy summer day, she left the child behind and vanished from Kim's son. In despair, Mr. Kien had plunged into the rain-soaked streets, calling her name. His mother and the household staff claimed that Kim Lai had taken a large sum of money from her, abandoning their child for riches. From that moment on, he harbored an intense loathing for singers. 5 years later, they found Kim Lee's body drifting in the river, and she was buried on a hillock. Later, when Mr. Kien's mother passed away, remorse drove her to reveal the truth of that year. She had used force to take her granddaughter, binding Kim Lai and selling her to a salt trader in Saigon, ensuring she would never return. Hearing this truth filled Mr. Kien with profound regret. He believed that he had unwittingly caused the death of his beloved. A deep guilt lingered in his heart. For a year, he had searched for a way to bring her back but had no idea how to face her, how to confront his past transgressions. It seemed easier to remain silent, to bury the truth, just as he had lived in peace for the last 15 years. Now, confronted by his own mistakes, he felt unbearable anguish. He sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, until the first act of the performance was nearly over. Bringing him back from his reverie, he grasped the lantern, slowly approaching the cupboard, unlocking it with a key. It had likely been years since anyone had opened that drawer. He retrieved an intricately carved wooden box, his fingers trembling as they brushed against it. Inside the box lay a jade bracelet, a handkerchief embroidered with 2 butterflies dancing, and a black and white photograph. Despite the passage of many years, the photograph was impeccably preserved, as if it had been taken only yesterday. With a trembling voice, Mr. Kien called out softly, "Do you want to return to me? I know you never considered this place home. It was nothing but pain for you." He paused, grappling with his emotions. For over 20 years, he had carried hatred for her, allowing her to lie alone and nameless, bereft of dignity. Clenching his jaw, he continued, "Tang Trung, our child, the one I have always held such high hopes for, is gone." He left in anger. "Perhaps it is my stubbornness that has driven him away. I could not accept my past foolishness that hurt you, that hurt our child for these 15 years. His fingers caressed the photograph once more, tears streaming down his cheeks. "When you died, he must have been devastated, must have harbored deep resentment towards me. Forgive me, Kim Lai. I beg your forgiveness." In that dim room, only the faint light of the oil lamp remained, mingling with the intermittent sobs of a man weathered by life's storms. At that moment, the curtain fell on the first act. On stage, the vibrant colors of the performance danced, accompanied by crystalline voices that filled the air with excitement, the applause echoing endlessly. Meanwhile, little Binam hurried off for water, anxious to return in time for the next act. As he passed a turn in the hallway, he suddenly spotted Minh Khôi standing there, lost in a stupor. "Hey, Sister Ba, aren't you going to watch the show? Why are you just standing here?" Minh Khôi jumped, turning to face Binam. He noticed her face was pale and her eyes bloodshot. "Uncle Ba, are you feeling unwell? Your face looks so pale. Do you need me to get you some medicine?" Minh Khôi waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, Uncle, I just drank a bit too much. I'll rest for a while." Binam scratched his head. "Well then, do you want some water? I can get it for you." Minh Khôi waved again. "No, it's fine. Just go on." Once Binam had left, Minh Khôi remained, gazing out at the lively stage. Moments ago, he had seen Mai Chao in a brilliant golden costume, still performing the final act of Dalan Tan. Just before her death, it was that very voice, that very demeanor, even her face, that remained unchanged. As Minh Khôi watched, his legs felt weak, his heart racing fiercely in his chest. Fear gripped him. He worried someone might see the terror etched on his face. The image of Dalan, clad in golden attire, her body ablaze in red, her face ghostly white, haunted him. There were many things he felt he would never forget. Perhaps because he had killed that girl with his own hands. At that time, he was on the verge of marrying Tien Kim. Dalan had called him to the riverbank that night, claiming she was pregnant, asking if their fleeting love could sway him to change his mind. But he had hesitated, unwilling to yield, fearing she would use the child to blackmail him. In a moment of desperation, Minh Khôi had accidentally pushed her into the river. Initially, he intended to reach out and save her, but he ultimately did not. He thought that if she died, no one could ever threaten him again. No one would ever know that he had once been cared for by a singer. He stood on the riverbank, watching the girl who had once shared his bed sink slowly into the icy depths. Now, that image of the actress haunted him, just like Dalan had resurfaced in flesh and blood from the bottom of the river. At that moment, the hallway was completely deserted, shrouded in darkness, save for the gusts of wind that tossed his hair. Minh Khôi stood there for a long while, until he suddenly heard footsteps behind him, echoing softly, assuming it was a guest. He wiped his face and turned around, but behind him lay only emptiness. Furrowing his brow, Minh Khôi tilted his head slightly. Suddenly, from the shadowy corner near a potted plant, he spotted a pair of red shoes slowly advancing toward him. "Who's there?" The figure remained silent. "Hey, who is it?" As he approached, he saw a girl with long black hair down to her waist, clad in a red dress, her feet adorned with embroidered red shoes, standing with her back to him. Who are you?" Before Minh Khôi could touch her shoulder, she spun around, revealing a ghostly white face. Blood streamed from the corners of her eyes, and her dark lips curled back to reveal two sharp fangs.